problem that was his life was never to be solved. His wasn't the kind of life where there are aims that are clear and means that are clear, and where it is possible to say, this is essential and that is not essential. This I will not do because I cannot endure it, and that I will do because I can endure it. There was no unsnarling an existence whose waywardness constituted its only authority and provided its primary amusement. He wanted his mother to understand that he wasn't blaming the futility on Morty's death, or on her collapse, or on Nicky's disappearance, or on his stupid profession, or on his arthritic hands. He was merely recounting to her what had happened before this had happened. That's all you could know. Though if what you think happened happens to not ever match up with what somebody else thinks happened, how could you say you know even that? Everybody got everything wrong.
Hi, this is Eric.
And this is David. Welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast. On this episode, we are reading Philip Roth's Sabbath's Theater. And if you're joining us after first finding us through Toni Morrison's podcast, this is going to be a very different book being discussed. Also joining us on this podcast is Stephanie Johnson, a member of the book club.
Very happy to be here.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
So I thought first, Eric, if you could, as a man who has read this book at least twice, if you could give our listeners a little introduction to what this book is and maybe how we can talk about it.
Yeah, this book is from 1995, and it's basically the story of what my good friend Michael calls the depraved puppeteer Mickey Sabbath. Mickey is a boisterous, fallen from grace puppeteer in his early 60s. He's basically, I would say, one of the most vivid and vulgar expressions of the male id that I think certainly Philip Roth has ever created, and possibly an example of that in all of literature. And in terms of the book, it's a very sort of simple story, I would argue, schematically. It's really just, Mickey Sabbath, mourning the death of his recent lover, Drenka, as well as other things like the recent death of a friend, and dealing with his current wife who is in rehab. And really it's a tragic comedic novel in the most literal sense. And I think that as someone who's read a lot of Philip Roth, I think a lot of the themes that he grapples with before this novel and in the work before this novel and the work after really are all sort of packed into this book. And I would say also, in a very intense way that he never really got to before this book, and I would argue never really got to after this book. And so I feel that it's a very important one, and one that I know he loved very much himself. I think because he reached this point where he felt he could sort of, talk about things in such a intense way that I think is a good place to start, because I think this book is, in terms of the behavior and just all-out id nature of Mickey Sabbath is very provocative and very off-putting. And I think that alone provides, I would argue, a lot of discussion around, what do we think of this book, whether it's now in 2018 or when it came out, or I just think there's a lot of ways out. But I think for me, the first thing is that rereading this again, I'm even reminded more of just, it's rare that I read a book that's so intense in the way that it expresses these feelings about sex and death and family and the body and Judaism and all these things that Philip Roth is famous for, but has never, I think, reached the fever pitch that it hits here. Any thoughts?
Well, I think you hit on sort of the major themes, and you mentioned the word provoke, and I think that's what this book does to its reader. It provokes a reaction. I don't think you can read this book without feeling something, like actually feeling something, not just thinking about it, but it's a visceral experience, because our narrator really puts you through the ringer of bodily functions, bodily desires. Yeah, it's certainly a provocation of some kind.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as if he provokes just for the art of provoking. A lot of his characters, there was one instance where, I think it was the very end of the book, where Matthew, the son, had arrested him at the gravesite of his mother, and I think Sabbath thought he was going to be killed by Matthew, and he started speaking to Matthew. Well, he said something along the lines of, I use the tone that I know annoys Rosanna the most. Like he knew the way to talk to people, to push their buttons. And he did that. I don't know why he did that. I think that's part of what the book wants you to figure out. What compelled him to provoke other people, and why did he need to do that? Was it because he thought that was the only way to live your life? Is that what actually constitutes a real life? I think, to me, that was a major theme of the book. What does it actually mean to live a human life, to be alive? And I think provoking people was part of his answer to that question.
And I think you kind of hinted at what is the dichotomy of the character as well, is he seems like he's being honest with himself, and he even mentions that this is what he's doing, but at the same time, you can tell that his actions are a performance in order to provoke a response out of somebody. And there's hints at the reasons behind that. If you want to go Freudian, you can go back to the loss of his brother and the way that his mother shut down and became a walking corpse. But there is no final answer in terms of why he's doing the things that he does. He doesn't seem to understand it. There are moments where he questions his own action, as like he's in the middle of an event asking himself if this is a performance, if he's just pulling some puppet strings and these things are happening. He doesn't know why he does those things. And as a reader, I think we're constantly asking why.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something really rich about how Roth is constantly making us, shift our alliances with him. Like at first, he's really repellent. Then for a while, you start to learn more of his story and you realize, oh, this guy's a human being. I can really understand where he's coming from. And then he does something even more repellent and you're like, oh my God. And then he brings it back. And I think it's really interesting how there's this very interesting Russian doll sort of flashback structure. Like there was like flashbacks within flashbacks here of how, the story unfolds. I mean, if you really kind of map this book out, not a lot happens, at least in terms of the passage of time. But the amount of storytelling and history and whatnot that goes into this is pretty incredible. I kept sort of losing track of where I was in terms of the time continuum, because he'll often talk about something that happened a month ago, and then he'll use that as a way to talk about something that happened when he was a young boy and then come all the way back. And I think as a formal device, it's very apt for Sabbath's state of mind throughout this book. But I'm also intrigued by how that structure also constantly, churns this like, oh, he's repellent. Oh, I can feel sorry for him. Oh my God, what's he doing again?
Do you think Roth really wanted you to feel sorry for him? Do you think that was the purpose of those flashbacks? I questioned that myself when he would talk about missing his brother and the death of his brother Morty.
At least to humanize him, right? I mean, this guy on paper is pretty repellent, right? I mean, it's if you just list what he does in a Twitter feed, to use a more contemporary thing, it's like, I think Roth has even said this, if he was sitting here right now on my couch, I would throw him out. I remember Roth made a quote like that. And I think that as an exercise in how literature can maybe at least make us question these darker corners of the psyche, whether ours or somebody else's, or at least contemplate them. The book is a very good provocation, because I think that whether we are willing to admit it or not, especially what I would argue in this very sort of walk on eggshells, zero-sum argument culture that we're kind of in right now, it's to even sort of contemplate that a little of what Mickey talks about is in all of us. Whether we choose to act on it or not, I think is the bigger question or issue. But the way the book pushes that right out in front of you to confront, I think, is a rich provocation. And there's a quote from Roth where he said about this book, I wanted to let the repellent in because we try so hard not to see it. We just throw an ugly name on it and look away. And I don't know if that's a provocation that is necessarily something that is so great today, considering where we are, but as it is, as one that makes us question our own individual psyches and lives, it's an interesting one, at least for me. I mean, I don't want to say that we're all sort of interested as much as I am in that, but I would be curious to know what you guys think about that.
Well, I think two things. The first, you're right, literature has a way of allowing you to view a life in a much greater way, to understand nuance than most interactions, I think. Like when you are dealing with a person in real life in the present moment, you don't have the time and the patience that literature forces upon you in order to look and examine a life. And then the second thing is the sort of subject matter of this book, which is pretty filthy for the most part. Stephanie, I know you, for our own benefit, made these graphs that show the number of times certain words are used.
Right, and I don't know if we're allowed to repeat those words on the podcast. I wasn't sure how PC, this podcast was. But I mean, so honestly, I did this for a couple of reasons. The main one being, I think we all know, kind of the elephant in the room. The provocation that Roth is seeking in this book deals mostly with women and is of a sexual nature. But I didn't. There was some things that shook me about this book with respect to women. And I felt like there's quite a bit of misogyny in the book. Anyway, so with the table that I made, I kind of wanted to go through the different words that he used and some of them, the frequency of the words. And so we do have, using fucked well over 200 times in the book. But then some of the top words are all kind of geared more towards females, being, breast, whores, cunts. And then you get down into the words meant for men. But a lot of the vulgar words are actually geared more towards women. And I don't know if this is just a way for me to quantify misogyny in a book. I guess my logical brain wanted to do that, just to say, I think this book does have, tones of that. And I want to prove that to you with evidence. But it was somewhat of a difficult book to read from a female. It was a difficult book to read from a female perspective because And I've read several other of Roth's books, and I think the only book I've actually ever read of his where there was one female character that I think actually had some substance to her was, I think her name was Dawn in American Pastoral. It was the wife of the Swede who actually, had a life outside of her husband, or outside of the way that Roth described her. I just feel like a lot of the women, especially in Sabbath's theater, they're only there to counterpoint the main male character. There's no substance to them, and a lot of their actions are fantasy actions. A lot of this stuff, like there was an example at the end of the book where he comes home and Rosanna, his wife, is, I believe, masturbating with another woman in the living room. And that was one example and he was fantasizing a lot of it, but acting as if it was real life. And I was just like, this would never really happen. You're just putting this out there because you want it to happen. And you're making these female characters do things that they otherwise would never do. I don't think. Yeah. So that was difficult to read. It was just not difficult, but just, I guess for me, it was vapid. Yeah.
I would argue that was one of the places that really pulled me out of the book, was that exact scene that you mentioned here. And you're wondering, is this a performative aspect of Sabbath? Is it the kind of performative aspect of Roth? And I think when you get into more of his work, you realize that there are these moments that I would argue in context now, but it's probably as much then, sort of pull you out because of that aspect. But I'm curious to hear from you guys too. What did you guys think of the character Drenka in the context of what you were talking about?
Well, so that was very interesting because I think in one of the first 50 pages of the book, one of the quotes is, Drenka thought more like a man than she did a woman. So to me, he even made her from a male. He wasn't even trying to make her a woman. I think he just made her from the male perspective, and he didn't even attempt. I don't know that when I saw that line, that really stood out to me. That he was like, well, we'll just pretend she acts like a man, and we'll go with that. I thought that was interesting.
I haven't read enough Roth to really say, and I tend to eschew authorial intent as a general rule as a reader, but tended to view the misogyny through the character of Sabbath. I mean, he's the one who is viewing this. He's the one going through these fantasies. He's the one obsessed and weakened by his perversions. I agree. He is a misogynist. I don't look at this character as someone who is deserving of respect.
But what's really
which is weird, because even though I had trouble in moments reading the book, I also enjoyed reading the book, and I don't like him, and yet I laughed at some of his jokes. I found his insights into other aspects of life, especially death and dying, to be interesting and engaging, which is, I think, goes back to the idea of him as a performer. He really has a way of pulling you in. Otherwise, I don't think anyone would be able to read 400 plus pages of this book. He's incredibly engaging, even though he's despicable.
Well, I think it's a testament to Roth's, writing, that he can make you want to read this. And I think what's very interesting about his writing for me is, especially in this book, is the vivid nature of this character. I mean, however much you despise him or find him repellent, he is flesh and blood like very few characters that I have read in literature. And it's interesting. I read somewhere whereas one of his peers, like John Updike's work, was always very descriptive. Like, he was just really good at describing the scene. I think Roth tends to eschew all that kind of, I'm going to describe, the rich kind of scenery around you, and instead, like, put you in the head of these characters in a way that feels like you've been face-offed into one of these, characters. And the way that these monologues that he writes that sort of have this rolling kind of intensity, I think it's just this vivid, rich, emotional embodying of these characters. And even if at the end, if you back up and think no one would talk like this or go on a rant like this, it still has this very vivid quality to it that I think is what makes it so compulsively readable. And so when you combine that with the repellent nature of this character, it's fascinating to me that someone even male like myself could get through this book. And I think what I was discussing earlier is how when I first got a copy of this book when it came out, I think I was 25, I got 50 pages in and I'm like, I don't know if I can do this. There was just too much pushed up in my face that I just felt like I don't want to go through 350 more pages of this. And
I think at that point he was already masturbating over a grave and
that was
looking at other men's.
Whoa!
I mean, and I had read Henry Miller at this point. I was an adult. It's not like I hadn't been exposed to sort of this type of thing, but I just think the whole combination of the sex and the death so vividly rendered in such a repellent character was like, I can't go here right now. I don't know why, but I just can't
I'm
go
not old
here.
enough for this. I'm not jaded.
And then it was funny because when I finally read it again, which was probably 9-10 years later, it rose to what I thought might be one of my favorite books of his. But I think at that point, as you get older, you tend to see things in a little less black and white. And I think as a young person, and when you have these ideals about how you should act and be, reading this book is a real, litmus test, for lack of a better word. And I just think, in hindsight, I just don't think I was ready for something like this. And that's kind of what makes the book really good. And I would say also still somewhat troubling, especially in light of what Stephanie was talking about.
Yeah, I think, and David, you touched on this a little bit, but part of what kept me going through the book was the witticisms and how funny Sabbath could actually be. I mean, there was a few quotes that he had. There was one about one of his ex-wife's father, who was a geologist, something along the lines of, he was a professor of geology, and so he knew how to wash the dishes better than they did. There was just little things like that where you're like, hey, where you would just kind of laugh out loud at the things that he would say. And I think that was actually one of the things I liked most about the book. It's saving grace somewhat for me, all other things aside. Yeah, because I just felt like as much as, Sabbath, and then Eric, you were talking about this, he wants to be, kind of redeemed. It was just very difficult for me because I felt like he was pushing, what I think he thought he was doing was he was pushing back against this bourgeois ideal of repressed sex.
Sabbath
mostly
or
with
Roth?
Oh, I'm sorry. Sabbath or Roth, actually. Yeah. This bourgeois ideal of repressed sex. And he thought that by introducing these women to, more risque forms of sex, he was opening up their minds and doing all these things for them, while in reality, he was actually harming a lot of the women. And there were actually several in the book that were very young. And you get kind of, that was what was so repulsive to me, where you're like, you believe that you're doing all these things because it's right and you need to push back against these constraints in the world, but you don't actually realize what's happening to the other side. Again, it's just, and we've mentioned this, it's just very id driven and hedonistic.
See, I don't think Sabbath actually believed that, though. I think
you don't. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sabbath knew exactly what he was doing. I think he was gratifying himself. Oh,
he just didn't care?
No, he absolutely did not care.
Okay, yeah.
I think he tells himself he's doing certain things, and he might rationalize it, but then he shoves that off, because there's a line somewhere where I think his friend, who's trying to help him, says that he always fought being a human being, and he says, to the contrary, I've said, whatever is human, just let it come to me.
Right.
He is driven by almost pure bodily function and desire without any restraint or control. After the fact, he'll try to rationalize something and make it something, but in those moments, I don't think he has much consideration for anybody
but himself. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, and there's two things that come to mind for me. One, I think in the character of Drenka, I think Roth was trying to both trying is the key word there, to create a more flesh and blood female character. But I think his idea of that was, I'm just going to make her as sexually ravenous as Mickey. And I think the reason I ask about Drenka, the original question, is because, do we find that part of her as a character, or as her as a character period, to be believable? Do we feel like he accomplished that at all? And I am ambivalent about whether he actually did that or not, but I want to go back to the original question and sort of, because I think Drenka as a character in this novel is fairly unique as a character in any sort of literature of this ilk, but I would argue somewhat unique in Roth's work too. And so, as someone who's read more of it and asking those of you who've read less of it, again, like what I liked Stephanie, like, oh, he's actually just trying to make her a man, and that's how he gets off the hook with this character. But I don't know. There was something to me that was pretty unique about her too, and I don't know how you guys feel about that, but I kind of want to stay on that for a second, because I think it's a key to sort of a lot of what we're talking about here.
It's always important to keep in mind that every character is filtered through Sabbath. So whatever idea we have of her comes through the character. And I think there's an odd sort of tenderness between the two of them that is kind of endearing, because it seems like he found his match, right? So the novel opens with her giving him an ultimatum, and he, of course, doesn't want this ultimatum of not being able to, according to him, fuck another person, even though internally he's not going to do that. He's more or less dedicated to her in a way that he is not dedicated to anyone, even his own art. And so there's something kind of nice about that. And there's a moment, and this we'll touch on it and appease Nick's scatological desire to talk about the pee scene.
Oh, right.
Uh-oh.
So near the end of the novel, I believe he is driving back home talking to the ghost of Drenka about her time in the hospital dying of cancer. And they reminisce about this time when they decided to push their lovemaking to a different level and urinate on one another and even into each other's mouths. It was a weird scene to read.
But somehow it read as love. That's, and you're like, wait, do they love each other? And is this how their love is being shown to one another? It was
And there just
surreal.
went 50 listeners of the podcast. Well, I mean, I talked about this book being a litmus test, right? And I think this scene, this particular, if we want to call it, no pun intended, a climax of this book, to me, it's the ultimate litmus test. It's like they're having this moment. She is dying. She doesn't want to die. He is super upset. It's a very intense scene. And all of a sudden they throw in that, what they really shared together most special was this, to them, this moment. And so right in this part of the book, you're like, wow, I have a lot of empathy for what's going on here right now. But I'm also just kind of grossed out a little bit that this is what they share together. And so talk about a moment where you're trying to reconcile, the existential things that are happening in this moment, and then these just very sexually outliers moments between them as what they hold to be both most special to them. It's a real, to me, it's the moment where the reader is really torn, I would argue, around, suddenly there's this really like, oh my God, everybody dies and it's horrible for everybody. And no matter how much I hate this guy, I'm starting to feel at least a little bit of sympathy for him. And then it goes to here and you're like, okay, I don't know if I still have that feeling. I mean, at least for me, it was just constant push and pull. And again, it's sort of this constant sort of, we have to remember that we're seeing it through Mickey's eyes, and this is more Mickey talking than Drenka, but still, we have to at least honor, hopefully, that he's recounting this in a way that is truthful, at least to him. And so, to me, that scene really epitomizes a lot of what this book is trying to do. I mean, would you guys agree? Or Stephanie, you just sort of like, no, I couldn't go there, or it's a cheap shot, for him to pull the cancer in at that point.
I mean, I think he just, there was always that dichotomy. There were some pretty heavy elements of this book with respect to death and dying, and then as well as what it means to love someone, again, what it means to be alive and a human. And I think every time Roth would go down the route of, or the scene where he was talking about, the cancer scene where Drenka has cancer and she's dying in the hospital, he couldn't just let that be a beautiful scene about characters. There had to be some aspect of repulsion. Some, again, like you were saying, a sexual outlying moment that kind of took you out of this is a beautiful element of the book or a beautiful comment about the human condition. And then bring in peeing on each other. I don't know. It was just,
he doesn't let you have it.
Yeah,
he doesn't let you have that
yeah.
sort of release of like, oh my God, they're finally human. Oh, I can finally sort of relate, or whatever the right term is to them.
It's because I think for Sabbath, that's his life. That's what makes him human.
Right. And it's interesting too, because, and this is probably a good, interesting place to pivot to this a little bit, but, I've talked in the past to you and Nick, at least David, about a lot of the attraction to Philip Roth to me was he was an author that when I started to read adult books, my father was like, oh, you should check out this author. I remember when I read this book, Portney's Complaint, it just blew my mind because it just sort of spoke to my experience. And when I say experience, I mean the sort of post-war Jewish male experience, right? And I think that my father explained to me, he goes, you can't understand what an explosion Portney's Complaint was when it came out to people like me, let alone, I think it sounds like, from what I understand historically, the literary establishment. And what's interesting about Sabbath theater to me is that if Portnoy's Complaint opened up the door of this experience to people, in some ways Sabbath theater seems to be a bookend to that. Like, I have taken this as far as it can go. And here's where it's gone. What do you think about where we ended up? Because I don't know, there seems to be a hint of Sabbath as, when the 60s opened up, a lot of the freewheeling attitudes around everything from sex to down the line. You could argue that this book is sort of both a end game and arguably even a cautionary tale of, where that freedom has taken us. But to go back to the Jewish thing too, there were a few lines in here that, as someone raised at least Jewish, just made me howl. And I think this goes back to what you said, David. There's this quote where he says, "Wrong. It's only when I'm shouting that I begin to think straight. It's my rationality that makes me shout. Shouting is how a Jew thinks things through." And I just laughed my ass off when I heard that, because that is so true, at least in the little shtetl that I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and my relatives. This was a big thing. But furthermore, he said something later. He said, "Another sentimental Jew. You could fry the sentimental Jews in their own grease. Something was always moving them." I think that in some ways that is not a bad mission statement for what Roth was trying to do here. It's like, I'm going to get you all the way up to the line of like really feeling for these people in that sentimental schmaltzy, to use a Yiddish word, way. And then I'm going to pull it back really fast. To me, there's something really interesting about the intersection of this sort of Jewish sensibility that I think Roth has embodied for a lot of his career, and then what he's trying to get at in terms of art and freedom and America, that really comes together in this book. And this is what I mean by this book can just go off in so many different paths in terms of discussion. But at the same time, the other sort of line I think of discussion here that I talked about before is how valid or relevant of a point of view or a discussion topic do we feel that is now in 2018? And I think this is something that came up in a lot of the obituaries when he died a few months ago, was that, are we going to be reading Philip Roth in 30 years or not? Does what he captured in his body of work going to have relevance? And this book to me is a really good place to, I think, discuss that a little bit. Is this post-war Jewish straight male, id-raging, sexually obsessed something that feels like a relevant topic in 2018 amidst everything that's going around?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, because after I read Sabbath Cedar, I read American Pastoral, which I think was written within 2 years of each other. And both of those books deal with the same themes that you were talking about, and like war, World War II, and people coming home from that war, as well as Vietnam, and people not coming home from that war, affected a lot of the characters. But I think, I feel like a lot of the book was kind of talking about the turmoil and almost the absurd of things that were going on in America at that time. If I'll give an American Pastoral example, but Mary, kind of the daughter of the main character, the Swede, just kind of are going crazy in her overzealousness to support the Vietnam War, or I guess her support against it, in blowing up different establishments around the United States, and just how ridiculous that was, I think, from Roth's point of view. So it's a great question to ask. Is that still like that, the anti-establishment viewpoint, is that still relative today, with the things that are going on, especially in the U.S.? And I think I would say it is. I think there's still a lot of turmoil and people that are disagreeing with a lot of different things in our country.
David, any thoughts on that?
In terms of literary value, after Roth died, you got a sense that Roth served as a litmus test for literary wokeness, almost, online. And there were people that said, he was an overrated white male who wrote about, blah, blah, blah. And then other people said, he's a great author who did this. And as someone who at that point had not yet read any of his work, but had this idea of him as just a stodgy American post-war writer who probably wrote too many books and had outdated ways of thinking, I was pleasantly surprised by this book, even though I tended to dislike great portions of it, because Roth is doing something interesting in that he is really just showing something in great detail in a way that a lot of contemporary books have a hard time doing without imposing some moral claim. if you sort of peel it back a bit, you read into this character and you make your own assessment, your own judgment. There's a sense that the reader is responsible for at least half of the interpretation of the book. And I appreciate that as a reader.
I also think, too, I'd used the word vivid before, and I've also said in book club, I think especially when we read Bellow and Henderson the Rain King, is that I, at least, have always been attracted to books where I feel like something is at stake. Like there's a fever pitch or something the author is really trying to grapple with something in a vivid, intense way. And when you read those books, it's just like your heart rate goes up because there's such an intensity in the way that they grapple with these issues that is so visceral, the word that you used earlier. And I'm not going to mention any names, but when I I've read a lot of contemporary fiction and by a lot of authors from a lot of different walks of life, and there's something that there's an intensity of something at stake that I rarely seem to get in a lot of the literature that I read from today, and I think it's mostly because the culture has shifted. And I pulled a few quotes in from some other things that I had read before, like from Martin Amis, who talked about, like, we're at a time now where social realism is really the thing that people want to read, and the complexity that are in other books from before are not something that we want. I don't know if he's right, but it's an interesting assessment coming from him. And so, I don't know, it's funny when I talk about his books, I can just get into these cul-de-sacs of discussion because they spark so many things about the way I think about literature and culture in general. And it's just interesting to me that.
But what do you think it is about the culture today that changes the intensity of the books that are coming out?
Well, I think because we're in a very cautious time. David went back to sort of talking about being woke, and I think that I encourage you all to read this book that Lisa Halliday wrote called Asymmetry. It's really actually a pretty good book. Again, much more reserved than Roth, but but still very good and very interesting. And there's the first half is this Romana Clef of her relationship that the author actually had with Philip Roth when she was like in her late 20s and he was in his 60s, which is already, I can see people going like, ugh.
Or 70s, I think. Yeah.
He was older. And he encouraged her to write it, like, and it's a very sort of, it's not a character assassination, but there's a moment in there where he asked her, like, what are you writing about? And she's like, I don't know. I just can't write right now. And he's like, why? You should write about your father. It's a very interesting story. And she goes, no, I feel like I should be writing about politics or the world or something like that. And he's like, why bother? His whole thing. He didn't say that. He said something more erudite, but the gist of his response was, why bother with that? The world is the world, and we can't control that. And then the next half of the book is this fictionalized story of an American-born Iraqi getting stopped at the airport in the UK and being put in, like a detention area while they clear his passport. And to me, this book is really interesting because it seems to be both kind of acknowledging that this kind of writing and by extension author was important, but we need to be thinking about the second half of what I'm writing about more because of the world that we live in right now. And so I think people both feel more beholden, I think, to maybe write about something bigger than this insular psyche that Roth straight male psyche that Roth constantly mined. But I also think we're in a cautious time where being woke also entails a certain degree of responsibility that I think a book like this, if it was published today, would just be pilloried, and maybe rightfully so.
But I think what's interesting about this is it sounds like to me the definition of being woke in this sense is, if you're coming at it from Philip Roth's perspective, write what you know. And so what he knew was the white male id, right? So in this sense, being woke is actually being able to read books from people of all different walks of life. So instead of all, books or art or all these things that are in our society that are deemed classical are mostly all from white males, correct? Right. Yeah. So maybe being woke is actually allowing different viewpoints to become classics And so and then people can write what they know, but then it's not, we don't have to fictionalize what we think other people are going through.
Well, I would argue that in some ways, Lisa Halliday is saying, no, we as authors need to imagine things beyond our everyday sort of what we know worlds, right? And I think that's what's really amazing about this book that she's written is that I think you're right too, but I think that what's amazing about her book is that she imagines this male American-born Iraqi in this thing, and it's very vivid. And so, again, the book is interesting in that I'm not sure what it's trying to get at. I mean, that might be its sort of flaw, but it's like, wow, she imagined a really rich character that I believe here that is totally not her, totally not related to her at all. And so, anyway, you guys need to read the book.
That's interesting. Was there a Philip Roth book where he writes from a female's perspective? Are there any of his or any other perspective?
I mean, I think there are obviously very strong female characters, but I think it's rare that the book is written from their point of view. And I'm a little sentimental to do something that Mickey Sabbath would hate. Around the fact that, I think after rereading this book, I love it, but I think we're kind of past this now as a culture in some ways. And so I mourn that a little bit because I loved it so much, but I also acknowledge that there are things in this book and by extension his whole body of work that are hugely problematic in the way that we are looking at culture and literature now. And I would hate to see the things that he really gets at about being human that are really rich be dismissed because of the other stuff that we talk about that is troubling. And maybe that's just the way it goes. I don't know. But it's made me think about it a lot rereading this book. I don't know, David, any thoughts being the literature teacher you are?
So I just want to jump back to Sabbath for a minute and talk about how it could be read in today's world. And I came across an article in the Los Angeles Times, and the title of the article is "In the Age of Me Too, Philip Roth Offers an Unlikely Blueprint for Feminists." And her essential argument is that what Roth is writing about is really the idea of male failure. She mentions a quote that Roth even said. His own argument to the argument that he is a misogynist was that he's actually writing about masculine power impaired, that these men that you see in his novels, and I think we can look at Sabbath as a man who is impaired.
I agree.
Thumbs up from Stephanie.
Yeah. But that's an interesting take because, I mean, even you're reading American Pastoral now. I finished that not too long ago. Their main protagonist of that novel, the Swede, I would say, was also impaired to an extent, which led to a lot of issues with his family. But he was impaired in a 180-degree different way from what Sabbath is. So it's interesting that Roth, he uses different characters like that and their different flaws to show, if you're too far left or too far right, there's problems. Maybe there's a happy middle ground somewhere for these male characters. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good. I read that article too. Now that you mention it, and I think, if I go back and think about all these characters that have driven his novels, they are all impaired. He has never presented any of these characters as ideals. And I also think Roth was also prone to quoting the famous Flaubert line about, be boring in your everyday life so you can be completely transgressive in your work. and I think, judging from this Halliday book and the way she characterizes Roth, I think he was a very private, kind of little bit OCD, but, very kind of normal guy that chose to kind of channel a lot of these questions or this angst or this, id-based rage into his books. And, I think that, I don't think that he would ever proclaim to talk about any of his characters in a way that they are heroic by any sense. If they're heroes, they're flawed, fallen heroes like the Swede from American Pastoral.
Right.
Maybe I'd like to close by asking, because I know the answer I think Eric will give, but I'll start with Stephanie. Is this a book that you think will hold up? Is it a book you would recommend? Who would you recommend it to and why?
Is it a book that I would recommend? That's difficult. I think after reading American Pastoral, I would definitely recommend that over Sabbath Theater, and I think you would get a lot of similar elements of the human condition in what I think Roth was aiming to get across to his reader in American Pastoral that you don't have to go through in Sabbath Theater. Sans vulgarity, I guess, would be a good tagline for it. But if I was to recommend Sabbath Theater to someone, goodness, probably someone older, most definitely. But yeah, I think I don't know. Yeah, the article that you were just talking about is actually pretty interesting. Like, what is the cause and effect when the main protagonist male character is flawed? And yeah, it would be interesting to talk to other females about what they thought about the treatment of the women in Sabbath Theater, and maybe, well, I guess with respect to the flawed male character. So maybe older females. I don't think I would recommend it to anyone younger. Yeah.
Okay. There's an odd, it's not necessarily a movement, but there's an odd thing that happens, I think, when some people read something, they confuse writing about an idea with endorsement of an idea.
It's a good clarification.
Yeah, that's true.
And it's an understandable conclusion to make sometimes, especially when you spend this kind of page count on something.
Yeah, it's just difficult, right? I mean, because there was one example in the book where he was talking, I think it was Sabbath when he was younger, was talking to an Italian maestro, and the man was asking how young his girlfriend was, and he was saying, oh, well, I'm with this girl who's 15 years old, but I've been dating her since she was 12. And to me, yeah, when you say, yeah, it's not endorsement, but then, I don't know, that's just you're like, yeah. And then, what Roth in real life is 70 and dating a 20-year-old. I don't know. You kind of see the parallels there, and you can't help but see the parallels there, and it's somewhat difficult to.
I did not know that about Roth's real life, to be honest. And it's hard not to feel even more queasy at that scene.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think one of the questions I asked when I was making notes is, when is literature, and in this case, the embodiment of a character that behaves very abhorrently a worthwhile provocation, and when is it just abhorrent? And I think this is a question that came up for me a lot in this book is I understand what he's trying to do here. I understand sort of somewhat the provocation here, but did he really have to go that far to make the point? Right. And if the whole point is just going how far can I really go, just to see how far I can actually go. It was a question that I asked a lot. Is it something that is okay in the realm of literature, or is it too much? Is it not? Did he go too far? And maybe, I guess in the context of art, I would go, I'd rather he went too far than chicken out. At the same time, we should be acknowledging when he goes too far, at least for us personally, right? And in terms of, do I find it a book of substance? Going back to the way we've been discussing this, I have to say, in the moment, again, reading this book, in being in the moment of this book, it's rare. I go back to, I think I said this already, the vividness of it is incredible. It's rare that I think you find authors that can capture this vividness. But if we talk about it in terms of the context of how it lives in the world, especially now, there's a big question mark for me, for sure. As much as I appreciate its artistry, its formal sort of literary accomplishments, do those outweigh the sort of shortcomings in terms of the context and the actual things that it's talking about? It's a tough one for me, for sure. And I think it would be bad not to talk about the last line in this book too, which I think is a great line, and I think leaves an equal sort of both, wow, it's a great last line, and a question mark, right? Which is, he could not fucking die. How could he leave? How could he go? Everything he hated was here. And that's it, right? The end.
Think about that.
Yeah, I think that last line actually goes to his character very well, because it shows that he is a man who is driven by provocation as a sort of revenge on the world, because he hates it.
Because of what it did to him, or is that just inherent to his nature?
I mean, I think the book attempts to give reason to it a little bit, but it's hard not to view Sabbath as a creature, as a ghoul, as he calls himself, born this way. There's certainly not a suggestion that culture made him this way. No,
I don't think so either. I think, if anything, it was what happened to his brother. Yeah, and then, again, his mother, yeah.
Yeah, it's... I mean, at the end of the day, for me, it's a book of substance, because it really, and I don't know how long we've talked here, but this is certainly one of the longer episodes that I've been on. It certainly provokes a lot of thought, and I would argue a lot of really great discussion between just the three of us. That's why, to me, it's of substance, is because it's making us all look at this repellent nature of this character and really contemplate what that means in the scope of living one's life. And I don't know, to be honest, because of the way we're talking about things, whether it's through social media or the very kind of us versus them kind of culture that we're living in right now, are people even discussing things like this in this sort of manner? And so in that respect, I think that it is of substance for that reason. However much the particulars of this book have unnerved all of us in different ways.
Thanks for listening, everybody. You can find us online at booksofsomesubstance.com to check out artwork, see other podcasts, other books we've read. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at booksofsubstance. And join us next month where we dive into some Hemingway short stories. Until then, peace.